QSO Today, episode 341, Gerald Youngblood K5SDR. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by Icom America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers and accessories for the radio amateur, reminding you to check out their new IC705 all-band portable transceiver, now shipping from your favorite amateur radio dealer. My thanks to Icom America for their continued support of the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, 4Z1UG, your host. FlexRadio is the platinum sponsor of the upcoming QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo that will return in March 2021. That's just next month. In this spirit, I thought that I would bring back the interview that I recorded with Gerald Youngblood K5SDR in September of 2015. Gerald is the founder and CEO of FlexRadio that is now on the cutting edge of building advanced SDR platforms. Gerald was quoted as saying, "The FlexRadio's development of state-of-the-art software-defined radio platforms for amateur radio has had a flywheel effect as the company now builds advanced radio platforms for business, government, and military applications." K5SDR is one of the software-defined radio pioneers, and his ham radio story is the foundation of FlexRadio's story that he tells in this QSO Today. K5SDR, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Gerald?
Hello, Eric. Glad to talk with you. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, it's my pleasure, Gerald. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the very beginning of your ham radio story? How and when did it start for you?
Well, I guess in the earliest days, my mom had an AM radio and an old phonograph, and I was just interested in the electronics. I would look in the back of the radio and see what was inside, and I tore my mom's phonograph player open and looked inside of it, and then I decided that maybe I could extend the speakers. Somehow I got a hold of some speakers, and so I took some AC wiring cord with the plugs on it and used that as a speaker extension. Didn't know what solder was back then, so I just wrapped the wires around the speaker lugs and made a speaker extension. And that worked fine until my mom decided to plug that cord into the wall instead of the main cord, and smoke came out of the back of the radio. So that was my first, delve into actually hands-on electronics. It worked fine for me, but not so fine for my mom. I guess the next thing that moved me toward ham radio was someone, I don't recall whom, I was in middle school. Someone gave me a World War II transceiver. It was a huge thing. I don't even know what it was now, but it had, hundreds and hundreds of parts in it. I didn't know what those parts were. I didn't know what resistors were or capacitors, but I was fascinated with the parts. So I would tear it. I tore it all apart, pulled every component out of it and sorted it visually, and then got my hands on an Allied catalog, I think it was, component catalog, and that helped me. I would study the catalog, and that taught me what the names of the components were, so I could sort them and put them in cigar boxes and label them. And believe it or not, I still have those cigar boxes in my attic, and they still have the original labels on them. And that would have been maybe the early 1960s, maybe 63, 64, I'm guessing, that those boxes. And I still have them today. And I took a picture of them the other day, and I've used the picture in some of my presentations when I tell a little bit about my story. So that was my earliest days were fascination with electronics. I don't know that I really knew much about ham radio until probably my freshman year of high school. Might have been 8th grade, but certainly by 9th grade. A friend of mine, whose name I can't recall, from school, told me about ham radio and brought me over to his house. And I can still remember he had one of those big Hammerlin receivers. I don't even right now remember the model number of it. I'm sure the listeners would remember it. Had big dials on it. And I think he had a Heathkit transmitter, as I recall. And he introduced me to ham radio, and I instantly was hooked when I saw him talking to people at that time, Morse code. He was a novice, and he got me interested. Well, at the end of that year, we moved to another town, and that town, the high school was on the campus of a junior college, which is a community college, 2-year community college. And the physics teacher there was a ham, so I was very interested in learning about ham radio, and his name was Don Johnson. It's interesting, I couldn't remember his name until I was driving back from lunch today, and it just popped in my head after all these years. And so he was the physics teacher, and I approached him to be my Elmer, and he agreed to do that. And so I studied up for my novice test, which had a good, the novice test back in 1967 had a good bit of electronics in it, as I recall. I had to study pretty hard and learn the Morse code 5 words a minute. And I lived in a small town in Mississippi, and we had to drive to New Orleans, Louisiana to go to the FCC field office to take the test. And I can still remember the fear that I had taking the Morse code and waiting to get my results back. But that was about a 2-hour drive, as I recall, to go take my test.
Were you a driver yet at that point, or did you have a parent drive you in?
Oh, I had a parent drive me because I was not yet a driver. That would have been my sophomore year of high school.
I think half of my guests have had parents drive them to the FCC field office. I remember my mother driving me to San Diego, California, to take my test, and I was nervous, one, that I was using her time and that I should pass. What was your call sign, your novice call sign?
It was Whiskey November 5, Romeo X-Ray Victor. And later, when I got my general, it changed to WA5 RXV. Okay, and how long did it take for you to get your general? I think I got my general maybe a year later, as I recall. I think it was a fairly short time later because I was able to get a call book, found a call book, and I found my WA5 call maybe in 68 call book. Do you remember your first rig? Yes, I do. It was the receiver was a Halcrafters S38. The S38 was broad as the side of the barn. You could listen to most of the band at once, it seems like. And then I had my Elmer, Don Johnson, helped me build a 6L6 CW crystal control transmitter. Once you were general, did you take an upgrade to a different transmitter? I bought a Central Electronics 20A exciter. I don't know if you remember those. In fact, that has kind of an influence on my later story, but it was a rack mount exciter, had lots of knobs and lots of knobs on it. It was a phasing exciter, about 20 watts PEP on single sideband. Did that become your mode of choice, single sideband? Primarily, of course, I did CW as a novice, and I would say I was okay on CW, and really made a lot of friends on CW around the state, primarily on 80 and 40 meters. But I think sideband became my primary method then, and I actually built an amplifier for that 20A out of 1625 tubes. If you remember those, they're 12-volt 807s is what they are, and you had to saw into the base of the tube, the phenolic base, and pull the suppressor grid out and put it in another pin so you could make it a grounded grid amplifier. I still have that amplifier in my attic as well. Sounds like your attic would be a great place to explore. I've cleaned it out some, but there are a few things that I still keep. How did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your future education and then your career? I would say ham radio had an enormous impact on that. I grew up in small towns in Mississippi, under 1,000 people, so there wasn't a lot of technology and influence back in the 60s. in small towns where I grew up. And so ham radio just opened the world to me in more than one way. One was I was fascinated with the hardware and the technology and building things and designing things. And that led me to a decision to get an electrical engineering degree. And then the other part of it is communicating with people all around the world. That just was fascinating to be able to do that from my little bedroom where my shack was to talk with people all around the world. So those two things had a huge impact on me, and I ultimately got an electrical engineering degree when I left, finished high school and went on to Mississippi State University.
So you got your BSE from Mississippi State University.
That's right.
And then what happened after that?
Well, in college, I got interested in both the ham radio club and we actually were interested, some of the guys that I knew were interested in broadcast radio at that time. And so in my freshman year of college, I worked with a group of guys to get funding from the college and put together an low-power FM campus radio station. And so that was the first dealings with it. We had to deal with the FCC to get it licensed as a non-commercial station and beg, borrow, and steal all the parts to put it together. So that was one thing in college that was kind of interesting, and I did that both in our community college and then at Mississippi State. Worked with the FM non-commercial stations at both, and so that was one thing that went on there. When I finished college, I actually got a job offer before I finished. Well, actually, let me back up a second. Someone that I knew during my junior college days had gotten a chief engineering job at a startup UHF television station, Channel 16 in Jackson, Mississippi. And they were building the station literally from the ground up, the studios, the transmitters, the tower, everything. And he invited me to come work there in the summer, and then that became a co-op job where I alternated every other semester between working at the UHF station and helping to build everything. So literally that was a great experience to do everything from wiring up videotape machines to servicing them to camera systems and lighting systems, etc. So that was a great experience, and he was a ham, and he mentored me along as well. So that was another college experience, I would say.
What kind of rig did you run in those days, in your college days?
I built an Heathkit SB 301 and SB 401, and then the station console. So I really enjoyed that because kit building was fun. I enjoyed the precision of trying to make it look nice on the inside, where every wire was precisely placed and soldered and so forth. So that was a lot of fun.
Gerald, you're an entrepreneur. What businesses did you have before you created your current opportunity?
Well, I guess my first entrepreneurial experience was those radio stations in college. They were, especially the one in freshman year, was a startup where we started with an idea and ended up with a radio station on the air with people operating it every day of the week. So it was that was an entrepreneurial experience. And then I went out of college. I did work as chief engineer of a AM/FM broadcast station that was in the process of building a new facility, a new AM/FM studios. And so I got involved in building that from the ground up. But after about a year or two of that, I found that it was not a very exciting engineering environment once you got beyond the building of the station. And so it got pretty boring. And so I did my first, commercial startup. I think it was probably 1975, the year I got married. and started a PC board, raw board manufacturing company there in Mississippi. And so that was quite a learning experience for the first year of marriage.
I'm sure. Did you start the business in your house, or did you just rent a place?
We actually rented a place. A PC board manufacturing company, a real one, takes a good bit of space. So I had to go raise money from a local angel investor, and we bought equipment from a company in Florida that was shutting down its operations. And that's things like numerically controlled drilling machines, gold plating lab, all of the plated through processes and et cetera. We bought all the equipment and hired a guy to run it that had been working for the company in Florida, and brought him into Mississippi to run it, because I didn't know anything about running a PC board. It's a electrochemical process. So, but I got a lot of entrepreneurial experience, and we were in business for a little over a year and had landed some pretty significant contracts. One to build circuit boards for the Athena 2000 sewing machine, Singer sewing machine, and we got a 100,000 board order. And over the weekend after we got the order, the gold plating room caught on fire because somebody left the heaters on the gold plating tanks, and it shut us down. So that was 1 year in business, and I learned a lot.
It's a difficult school.
Yeah. But I would say along that time, like a lot of people, ham radio with a new wife and a startup business, ham radio kind of went to the side for a number of years at that point. A lot of people I talk to, that happens to. Life happens.
I was out for 25 years raising a family and working in a new business. I know exactly how that went. So along those lines, what impact did amateur radio have on your family life?
Well, I think that I would say during the early years and then child raising years that I kind of backed away from ham radio. And I always kept my license current, and I always had a station in the house, but I don't remember that I did a whole lot with it, probably from the time I got married until much later, which is part of the story. But I spent a career in high tech doing startups, mostly venture capital funded. I did work for another company for about 9 years there in Jackson, Mississippi, called Diversified Technology, and I learned a lot there about electronics and doing business with large companies. And we were a small company, but we did business with large companies, so I learned a lot in that process. And then started a company in 1986 with 4 guys I worked with, and we raised private capital and then venture capital. And ultimately in 1989, when we raised venture capital, we moved the company to Austin, Texas, which is where we live today. So that was a major transition in our lives. I wouldn't say, though, that I spent a lot of time with ham radio during those years, but it was always in the background. I guess, does that answer your question?
And now this message from Icom America. Love is in the air at Icom. This sweetheart of a package includes the Icom IC705, the perfect sidekick for hams that like to enjoy what is both great outdoors and indoors. The Icom IC705 is the perfect companion, with its base station features and functionality at the tip of your fingertips in a portable package covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters. This compact rig weighs in at just over 2 pounds with RF direct sampling for most of the HF band and IF sampling for frequencies above 25 megahertz. This fine rig supports QRP and QRPP operations. Features include a 4.3-inch color touchscreen with a live band scope and waterfall display, 5-watt transmitter power with a BP272, and 10 watts out with a 13.8 DC supply, single sideband CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functions, micro USB connector, Bluetooth, and wireless LAN, integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger, micro SD card slot, and the HM243 speaker microphone is standard equipment. Of course, the perfect accessory for the IC705 is the now available optional backpack, the LC192, with a special compartment for your Icom IC705 and room for accessories for soda activations or a day social distancing in the park. Let us not forget that the IC705 will replace the other company's radio as the first choice of microwave operators who need the very best baseband rig. Finally, there is a whole list of accessories and software for the IC705. For more information, go to Icom's website by clicking on the banner ad in this episode's show notes page. The Icom IC705 is in stock at your favorite ham radio dealer. And when you make that purchase, be sure to tell your salesman that you heard about the IC705 here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO Today. What was the name of the company that you moved to Austin with?
The name of the company was Sun River Corporation, and we had some of the major venture firms like Seven Rosen and U.S. Venture Partners, which were well-known, and Austin Ventures, which are well-known venture company firms. And so that was the company. We moved a group of people from Jackson to Austin and then restaffed here.
And what was the technology there?
We had actually built a technology that would allow you to put multiple graphics displays on a PC architecture in a multi-user environment over fiber optics. And we had developed the chips using ASIC technology and the software drivers and so forth. And it was to allow people to use the growing power of a PC, but put it in a controlled multi-user environment. So we were a little bit ahead of our time in some ways. I noticed that a company that we were competing with actually sold to Dell here a few years ago.
And that's the way it works in the venture capital world.
Yeah.
So let's get to the meat here. What is software-defined radio?
Well, software-defined radio, I guess in its simplest form, is where all of the modulation, demodulation, filtering, mixing, etc., is done in software so that it is done with the high precision that you can get mathematically, as well as getting rid of the analog distortion that you deal with and noise that you deal with in the historical analog systems. And because it's all in software, you can it's fungible. You can change it very easily. You can add and change modulation schemes. Everything's done in software. And we're now achieving that truly on HF because we literally digitize the signals at the antenna port. And on the receive path, unless you need a preamplifier, it's all digital. And you can build near perfect filters, for example, that are very narrow, brick wall filters that don't ring. And you can add new modulation schemes on the fly. So that's a little bit of a description of software-defined radio. You think of it as, in fact, even the hardware now is driven by software. We use field-programmable gate arrays where it runs at hardware speeds, but you can completely reconfigure the hardware through software.
What were the technical innovations that are responsible for the ability to even create software-defined radios? Well,
I think there are several. One is the mathematics to do it have been around, most of it since the very early days of radio. I mentioned the Central Electronics 20A exciter. That's a phasing exciter. It uses in-phase and quadrature signals to generate single sideband. And that technology has been around well before I was born. And the mathematics to do much of what we do today has been around. The problem is that you didn't have computing technology that was fast enough. When I was in college, we would print a deck of IBM cards and take them to a door, and you'd hand it through the door, and then an hour or so later, you'd get a printout. That was the world of computing technology. And if you wanted to do a fast Fourier transform, you'd get it back an hour later. Now, the machines could probably do, I don't know, thousands of, fast Fourier transforms an hour or something like that. I have no idea. Now your cell phone can do millions of them a second. I'm exaggerating there. I'd have to do the math, but the computing power you have in your pocket vastly outperforms what an entire room could do back in 1970, for example. So the computing power was number one. Number two, Moore's law about how that it's ever increasing in computing performance, and that also applies to the world of analog to digital and digital to analog conversion. If you can only sample at a few kilosamples per second, it's one thing, but when you can sample at 250 megasamples per second, or even now A to D converters that can go into the gigasamples per second, now you can directly sample the RF spectrum and capture that digitally all at once, and then you can process it completely in the digital domain from that point on. It really has to do with both the hardware and the software technology evolving now so rapidly that we have the power in a cell phone to do what you couldn't even dream of doing when I was in college. But the math is the same.
In one of the papers that you wrote, you said that the math is the Pythagorean theorem. You broke it down in a QEX article back to Pythagoras. Without going into a lot of mathematics detail, if possible, can you kind of explain what you meant by that?
Yes. And in fact, one of the comments that I make when I talk about this is that most of us learned the core mathematics of software-defined radios when we were in middle school, and that being the Pythagorean theorem, which is A squared equal B squared plus C squared. And then and that also means that A equal the square root of B squared plus C squared, and then you can take that, you can massage that basic mathematical formula to figure out the angles of vectors. Well, that's what we all learned in middle school, and it turns out that's the core mathematics of software-defined radios, which is we can take a signal on an antenna and we can bring that in and we can mix it with another signal to bring it down to an audio frequency, and then we can delay that mixer by 90 degrees and bring it down to an audio frequency, and now we have an in-phase and a quadrature signal, the 90 degrees being the quadrature signal. That's how single sideband transmitters have worked, phasing single sideband transmitters and receivers since before I was born. And that's the basic mathematics. Now we can take those signals and put them into an A to D converter and mathematically process them precisely, which in the past, in the early days of that type of technology, we had to do it with resistors and capacitors, and which didn't give us the kind of precision that you need to make perfect reconstruction of those signals.
In 2002, you authored an article in QEX called A Software-Defined Radio for the Masses in 4 parts. When you look back on that article some 13 years later, did you achieve your vision of what an SDR radio should look like?
I would say it's gone far beyond the vision I had at that time. When I first started on interest in software-defined radios was about 1999, and it was purely an intellectual project, a hobby project, just to see if I could build a radio using a sound card and a PC. And it was all about the hobby at that time. I didn't anticipate that it would turn into a business. And so I would say I didn't know what it was going to be. It was just for fun. And as I got into it, I realized how hard it was for me to dig out the mathematics and the learning that I needed to do, because I really hadn't done engineering in about 25 or 30 years at that point. And so I wrote the series of articles just to chronicle my experience of learning. And that was how the articles came about. And so I would have to say we've progressed far beyond what I envisioned it could be at that time, because we have so much more capable technology today than we did just, maybe 12 years ago when this turned into a business.
Well, what happened after that? And after that series of articles, what did you do to develop your expertise in this area?
In the early days, before the articles, the wonderful thing is that the internet came along. I don't think without the internet I could have actually done it, because I was able to study and learn from other people across the world just by typing in Google searches. And I also read a lot of books on signal processing that were helpful. But I would say that at the time that FlexRadio started, which is what I'm doing now, it was still uncertain as to whether there was a business here and how far it would go. What I did was I had written those articles. The first 3 articles I was still treating it as a hobby project, and I received emails from hundreds of people who had read QEX from all across the world. And many of those articles would say, I had kind of gotten bored with the hobby, but this got me back fascinated again. And it's reinvigorated my interest in the hobby. And so I said, well, that's interesting. Maybe there's something here. So in March of 2003, I decided to send out an email to all those people and saying, I'll build 10 sets of prototypes of this little SDR. At that time, it was called the SDR 1000. And I'd like to hear from you if you're interested, and if you are, tell me what your technical background is and why you're interested in it and why you should get one of these 10, because I didn't want to support a bunch of people that didn't know what they were doing. And I got 50 orders the first week and 500 the first year. So that was kind of the way things started. It was kind of an accidental company.
And that sounds like a great way to start. So then what happened after that? Did you ship 500 boards that first year?
We did, right out of the house. I had my kids were, some of them were in college, so they'd come home on the weekend and help me kit parts on the kitchen table. And so literally those first 500 were built between March and December of 2003. A lot of them went to Europe, too, not just the United States, but quite a number of those went to Europe that year.
And those boards were surface mount?
They were partially surface mount and partially through-hole. I actually had the surface mount done in Bulgaria, and then the through-hole was done at my house, hand-soldered.
In the first year, you shipped 500 of these boards. What happened after that?
Well, at that time, I was doing the hardware, the software, the support, the sales, the website, the accounting, everything. And there seemed to be continuing interest in it. And so my son-in-law was finishing up his engineering degree at University of Texas here in Austin. And I got him to come work with me for the summer, and he helped do some software and database work for our warranty support and all that. And then he finished his degree at the end of that year, and the market for engineering students was pretty bad in 2004 because of the recession. And I needed somebody to do software, and I told, his name is Eric, like yours, and I said, Eric, if you want to come work with me, your family, and I don't know if this is a good idea, we'll give it 6 months, let's see if it works, and then if not, no harm, no foul. So I said, come in and you take over all the software, because he had a computer engineering degree. And so he jumped in and started rewriting the software that I had done, and what he did became PowerSDR. And he's still here today. We work together today, and he did much of the authorship of PowerSDR, which is pretty well known in the software-defined ranks of the hobby world of ham radio. So that was kind of the next step in evolution.
Now, PowerSDR can be used with anybody's. It's open source, isn't it?
It is open source, and it's now used with a whole host of hobby-type software-defined radios. And we used it, we've used it over the history of the company with the Flex 5000, 3000, 1500, and of course the original SDR 1000. So it works with all of those products, and it's been adapted by the open source community through HPSDR to a number of different hardware platforms.
And it runs on multiple operating systems, run on Linux as well as Windows?
No, it's strictly Windows.
In an interview that you gave to Scott Morrison, KA3DRR, in 2008, you said that we were shifting into a visual era with the waterfall display. Can you go deeper into what you mean and the implications this has on a ham radio?
Yeah, I think that's one of the most striking things about software-defined radios is that it really changes the way you think about the radio spectrum. All of us have used radios through our lifetime that I now call blind radios. You have a VFO dial that has a numeric readout, and you have a knob, and you tune, and you're searching for signals. You don't know where they are until you kind of stumble across them. Well, with spectral displays that are ultra high resolution and the waterfalls that are high resolution associated with, we now have effectively high-end laboratory equipment on ham radio, where we can see signals that are well down below the noise floor of the radio, of the atmospheric noise floor. And we can see them in real time at wide bandwidths. And that allows us to have a totally different way of thinking about radio, is that we actually see signals before we hear them. We can see a signal on the spectrum display and click on it with the mouse, or now with touchscreen tap of your finger, and tune the signal instantly rather than twiddling the knob. You can still twiddle knobs, but you can see, you can point and shoot at signals. You also get a great appreciation for what the modulation schemes look like. Like, you can look on the waterfall and pen adapter and see a JT65 signal or a JT9 signal or a PSK signal or a sideband signal or AM or FM, and you instantly know visually what that signal is, and it helps you understand what modulation looks like. When I was a kid, I tried to get my brain around what these modulations look like, and it's hard to do. Now you see them. And you also see the good, the bad, and the ugly. You can tell when somebody is driving their transmitter too hard and over-modulating, and you can see key clicks and all of those kinds of things. Suddenly everybody's an official observer.
Are there any implications, do you think, for ham radio in terms of maybe attracting maybe a younger crowd to it because of visual displays?
Absolutely. In fact, Field Day is a great example of that. We have set up here in Austin one of our stations as usually you'll have a field day station that's for the newbies or the people that are just interested, and you bring them there. And that's where you'll bring the young people, and they will instantly gravitate to that versus the, historical types of radios that just have, LCD readouts and or maybe a small display. They will instantly gravitate. And I've also seen this with, we have a number of friends that are in their 20s and 30s that we know, and I've brought them to my house. And I have knob-type radios at my, I have a traditional kind of radio in my shack, as well as my more modern SDR. And I show them the visual display, and they instantly grasp it, even though they've never seen ham radio before, and they're drawn to it. And then I show them the older style radio, and I say, which one would you use? And they say, there's no question, I'd use the SDR. So I think that the visual part draws them in. The other thing is the marriage of computer technology and networking with radio. Is those three things together really can grab the interest of the younger generation if we put it in front of them.
Let me take a quick break to tell you about my favorite amateur radio audio podcast, and that's the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KJ6VU, Jeremy, KF7IJZ, and it now includes Michael Walker, VA3MW, where they pursue topics, technology, and projects on their ham radio workbenches every 2 weeks. The group documents their projects and makes circuit boards available to their listeners. They have interesting guests and go in deep. Jeremy may complain about the overall length of the podcast, but friends, let me tell you that I could listen to it all day, and that's good. Even if you are a seasoned ham radio builder or just getting started, be sure to join George, Jeremy, and Mike now for the Ham Radio Workbench podcast on every podcast player. Use the link on this week's show notes page by clicking on the image. And now back to our QSO today.
Do you see a company like FlexRadio building a lab version of your product that can act as a laboratory-in-a-box signal generator spectrum analyzer? I'm thinking like a service monitor, but essentially a black box that connects to your computer that allows you to work on radios and repair things, build things, design things.
It's funny. In some ways, we put a lot of those kind of features into our early radios because we were very focused on the experimenter community. Our more recent radios, we've tried to simplify in that regard because the population of true experimenters is much, much, much smaller than the population of people that want to operate radio. And so we've had to move to more of a plug-and-play kind of environment. However, we do find that our customers use our products as test equipment because the high dynamic range real-time spectrum display is better than the Agilent spectrum displays that you can spend a lot of money on. And so you can use them as precision measurement instruments as well. But would we actually focus on doing a piece of test equipment? But not in the short term because we have so many things on our plate that we're continuing to add on the software front from an operational standpoint for people doing, operating ham radio. But it's certainly not out of the question at some point.
What is FlexRadio's biggest achievement to date?
I think the biggest achievement may be that we didn't invent software-defined radios, but we did bring software-defined radio to the forefront of attention in ham radio. And that pioneering effort, I think, is really an accomplishment because now there are a lot of people that let me put it this way. When I started FlexRadio, I could go into a room and talk to 100 people, 200 people, 300 people, and if I ask, do you know what SDR is? And you might get 3 or 4 hands. Now, almost everybody in the room at least has heard of it. And that's quite a transition in that period of time, that people are now aware of it and starting to pay real attention to it, and there are a lot of people experimenting with it across the globe, and I think that's a real achievement. And hopefully we've had a positive impact on ham radio, and I certainly hope that we can use it to attract more young people, as you asked about earlier.
What do you think the biggest challenge is to FlexRadio and the SDR development business? What's the next hurdle?
Well, I think that probably one of the challenges has been that transition from what people are familiar with, because they've always done it, to something new and different. And that transition and the inertia that goes with that is a challenge for us. And that's one of the reasons we brought out a product called Maestro this year, is to make that transition easier. And it's really it's a wireless touchscreen display console with the right amount of knobs and buttons on it to be very efficient in controlling the radio. And so that provides a transition for people that are coming from that familiarity that they might have had with their earlier rigs.
It provides the tactile experience that their earlier rigs have versus just a straight keyboard and a mouse.
That's right. It gives you It gives you the high resolution display. It has an 8-inch capacitive touch screen, which is a big screen, by the way. It's not as big as what you can put on a computer, but it's a big screen for a radio console. And it gives you that tactile feel, and you can pick it up because it's wireless and battery powered. You can use it in the shack, or you can take it out by the pool, and one day you'll be able to take it with you anywhere. It just changes the way you think of radio.
So it has a microphone and speaker inputs on it?
Yeah, it has mic, speaker, headset, key. It has Bluetooth as well, so you can attach Bluetooth devices, and it has a gigabit Ethernet port, so you can plug it in wired. And the knob, the placement and the function of the knobs and buttons were driven by a couple of the top contesters in the world, help us design those. So it's really designed for contest operation, but because of that, it works equally well for the casual operator.
But this also means that you could build a remote station in a more quiet neighborhood or in a remote location and then operate that station from the Maestro.
That's correct. In fact, when you're operating it in your house, you're effectively remote because you're actually talking to the radio over internet protocol, either wirelessly or plugged in. So the extension of that outside your local LAN will be added in what we call SmartSDR 2.0, which will provide the added security and discovery and a few other things that you need to make that work well over the wide area network, because you don't want somebody to be able to just take over control of your rig, so you have to be able to provide the levels of security required to do that. So that'll be coming in the upcoming months.
Can you explain to listeners what a CDRX 3200 is and who would buy it?
Okay, well, no ham would buy it. I can tell you that right up front. Back, I think 5 or 6 years ago, we entered into a couple of government contracts to build some listening, or I would call them RF modems for certain applications, and those were done under government contract, and that's one of those contracts. It's not available to the general public. It would be primarily sold into government applications or academic, could be into some academic applications. And did you say the CDRX or LBRX? I forgot which one.
No, it's the CDRX. The reason I even know about it is because I saw a picture of it when I was looking at images under FlexRadio, and I said, ooh, rack mount 32 channel or 32 receiver console system. So that's the reason that I brought this up.
Yeah, well, that system has effectively 32 increased performance Flex 5000s in a 7U rack with a gigabit Ethernet port that all the data, 2 gigabit Ethernet ports, one is control and the other is data. And so it streams in-phase and quadrature data from 30 up to 32 receivers that are synchronous, phase synchronous.
So this means you put this box out in the middle of nowhere, connected to the internet, and you have the ability to listen to 32 different channels at the same time, or spectrums at the same time.
Effectively, that's true, but it wouldn't be on the internet typically. It would be streaming to a data gathering computer. That
may be on site or in close proximity.
Correct. In fact, it's too much data typically to stream over the internet. It's streaming a lot of data.
What is the best online resource for getting into and understanding SDR?
I would say that if someone, it depends on whether you want to be an experimenter or you want to be a user of SDR. So if you want to be an experimenter, the HBSDR group is a good place to start. I would just say that Googling ham radio smart SDR is a good way to do it. I frankly haven't been focused on that kind of on-the-line resources recently, since we're not focusing on the the experimenter community, so I don't have quite as good an answer for you on that one.
Okay, but if you're a user, FlexRadio.
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
That's a good place to start.
Come to www.flexradio.com.
What would be the rig of your choice if you were a new or returning ham to the hobby?
Oh, wow, that's an unfair question.
Well, I know that, but I should ask it anyway.
Well, if you're really new to the hobby, well, I'm certainly biased towards software-defined radio. It's hard for me not to be. Certainly, if somebody's just coming in and they don't have a lot of money, the used market is a great place to start. It's where I started, buying used markets, and you can buy legacy radios as well as software-defined radios in the used market and get some pretty good bargains to get started while you kind of decide what you want to do. And in fact, we have a low-cost Flex 1500 that is a great way to get your toes wet, and it's a very capable system. It outperforms most of the legacy radios many of the legacy radios, I'd say, on the market or in the used market. So it's a great way to get your toe wet for under $700.
In most cases, does a ham radio station that's running a Flex Radio Systems radio, should that computer be dedicated, or could it be the same computer that you do your email and stuff on?
Oh, it can be the same computer, and that's really personal preference. I use my computers for everything. The radio, and in fact, often I listen more than I talk, so I'm often listening to my radio on my computer while I'm doing work when I'm at home. And so you can do both at the same time. I might be doing email and listening to 20 meters. And I can have a window with the 20-meter spectrum, or maybe I'm watching 6 to see if it's open, and while I'm doing email or doing research on the web. So you can do both at the same time. Most any modern computer that you have these days can do that.
What does the K5SDR station have in it?
You've heard the story about the cobbler's children have no shoes?
Absolutely.
So Flex Radio actually was in my home station shack/office for the first, 6 years, maybe 7 years. And so it got a lot of wear and tear. We had engineers and technicians and people showing up at my house and working there. And I turned my son's bedroom when he moved into college into my office, and the playroom became the shipping room and all those kind of things. And so it got pretty worn. So I am just now remodeling my ham shack. And so I did a remodel earlier this year and did new built-ins. And so my station is now in a 12U rolling rack has a plexiglass door on it. It rolls under a built-in desk with shelves upon it, a wall type desk. It just rolls under there, and the radio, the computer, the antenna controls, the power supplies, my cable modem, all of that's in the 12U rack, and I can just roll it out and work on it. And then on the desk is a monitor and a wireless keyboard and a mouse and a microphone, and that's about all it is. So it's a very neat kind of shack. Everything's being controlled from the computer.
And is that a Flex 5000?
It's a 6700, Flex 6700.
If you were looking back on your younger ham radio self, is there anything you would do differently that you didn't do in the past?
Oh, wow. Haven't thought of that question before. You mean in the very early days?
Right now you're looking back on your ham radio life.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you would have pursued that you didn't pursue?
I think that if I had it to do over, I would have stayed a little more active during my years in keeping current with the technology and what was happening in ham radio. But I got to say, though, I don't. In retrospect, I could argue that I should have spent more time with my family than on career. So, in that regard, I don't know if I would have changed much.
Yeah, okay, I go with that. Before we say 73, though, what advice would you give a new or returning ham to the hobby?
I think the biggest thing I would say is be open-minded. Jump in and really try to learn about all the aspects of ham radio. Find something that you really enjoy and learn all about it. I think the thing that I would say frustrates me most is when I run into hams that don't want to learn, and they may have built their own transmitters when they were kids, and now they don't want to learn anything. And that really is saddening, I guess is maybe another way to do it. I hope I continue learning till I can't anymore. And that's the fun part for me. So I would encourage them to learn new things all the time, improve their stations, improve their operating skills, get out there and find an Elmer or be an Elmer. Those would be my encouragement.
Well, with that, I want to thank you so much for coming on QSO Today, Gerald. It's been my great pleasure. I'm going to wish you 73, and we'll talk to you on the air at some point.
Eric, it's a great pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. It was fun, and best 73s.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Gerald. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in K5SDR in the search box at the top of the page. Be sure to click on the Expo menu item at the top of the page for updates on the upcoming QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo coming next month. I'm updating this as I have more information. My thanks to Icom America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of Icom America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart, Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.